There are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know we don't know.
Hey, political junkies. This is your host, Claire Potter, and this is the Homefront edition of the Political Junkie podcast. Neil was off this week, and I'm fortunate that I have a special guest, my friend and former colleague, still my colleague, Jeremy Varon, a history professor at the New School for Social Research and Eugene Lang College. Jeremy has a great new book out called Our Grief is Not a Cry for War. It is about the anti-war movement. It really begins slightly before the 21st century, and it continues on into the present, really, since the United States really just got out of Afghanistan a few years ago, and we still station troops in Iraq. The bulk of Jeremy's book is about the movement to end the war on terror, how it got going, how people tried to stop it, how they failed to stop it, and yet how they continued their activism nonetheless. I want to take a second just to introduce you to Jeremy because he's a perfect example of someone who is really a scholar activist. You know, there are a lot of people who call themselves scholar activists, and their activism really consists of going on Twitter a lot and saying a lot of things to people in this sort of freelance pundit type way. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but Jeremy really puts his body on the line. He's been a member of Witness Against Torture. He has gone to Guantanamo to protest the continued incarceration of people who were captured decades ago in places like Afghanistan and Iraq and who were never tried. Some of them have never had charges lodged against them. Jeremy's commitments led him into research on the Weather Underground, which was the subject of his first book, published in 2004. But Jeremy also included in this book the Red Army faction, a revolutionary group in Germany that sought to protest what they saw as German acquiescence to the history of Nazism and anti-Semitism, and to really sort of strike back against the bourgeois German state that had taken over after 1945. It's a fascinating comparison showing how actually a lot of these activists talk to each other across the boundaries of state and nation, how they watched each other. And it really sort of looks at how young people tried to change the world by creating a revolution. Jeremy's new book, Our Grief is Not a Cry for War, takes its title from the survivors of another kind of violence, people who had lost loved ones, friends, and relatives in the attacks on the Twin Towers and the Pentagon and the plane that went down in Pennsylvania on 9/11. These 9/11 victims were said to want some kind of justice that included war. They vigorously said they did not. So, in fact, as the Bush administration rushed to war, people who had suffered terrible, horrifying losses actually joined up with an anti-war movement that had its roots in the 20th century, that had its roots in communist splinter groups, that had its roots in radical feminism. It's really an extraordinary book about how a peace movement comes together, what counts as winning Even if you lose the bigger struggle, the war, of course, happened. Peace activists couldn't stop the war, and yet they continued to make it visible, to use a kind of language they did not use then, but that we use now. They continued to insist that a state of war in the United States not be normalized. And that was a really important task because the war on terror went on actively for 20 years. And what it seems to have done is made a swift transition to a war on Americans under the Trump administration. So for those of you who want to know something about what peace movements do, how they hold themselves together despite the challenges, how very small amounts of people can make a really big difference, this is the book for you. But it's also a book for our particular moment as we face armed police, militarized beyond anything we might have imagined, being dropped into our communities, pulling people out of their cars, pulling people out of their jobs, arresting American citizens and incarcerating them, even though they're carrying papers saying that they are citizens, arresting people who are legal residents of the United States, and, of course, as we saw in the killing of Renee Good in Minneapolis, increasingly these soldier police, warrior police, whatever you want to call them, are using the tactics that are actually used in a war, that were used in Iraq, that were used in Afghanistan, that were used in Fallujah, and they are using these tactics to try and destroy a peaceful opposition to Trump's mass deportation policies. So I'm very excited to have Jeremy on the show this week, and I welcome you to this edition of Political Junkie. Jeremy Varon, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Jeremy, you are here today because of this beautiful book that landed on my desk, Our Grief is Not a Cry for War, The Movement to Stop the War on Terror. And frankly, Jeremy, I don't think our listeners could be reading this book at a better time in American history. You couldn't have known that when you started, but we are, in fact, it seems, engaged in a kind of war with the government now, and I'm hoping we can talk about that a little bit today. But I know you were involved with anti-war politics. Can you tell me what caused you to want to go to the other side on this and write a history of the movements you've been attached to over the years?
Thanks for the question. I mean, first let me say I was born in 1967, so in the shadow of the Vietnam War and in sort of the afterglow of the movement against the Vietnam War, which was reputed to be the biggest, the best, the most effective anti-war movement in history. And my sense of politics and morality were very much shaped by the social movements of the 1960s and the very passionate responses to, the Vietnam War. So I've always been fascinated by issues of war and peace as a historian, cut my teeth on big epic narratives detailing years and years and years of anti-war protest. And I always identified with anti-war politics, first from a pacifist standpoint and then more from a broadly anti-interventionist standpoint. I protested the 1991 Gulf War, which famously kicked the Vietnam syndrome in the butt. America had crossed the Rubicon of a major military intervention. And then when 9/11 happened, I was obviously horrified by the 9/11 attacks, but over time horrified by the American response, which was so reckless, so disproportionate, so pretextual in some sense, and so destructive that I felt a moral obligation, like millions of Americans and people around the world, to try to, end the Iraq War, oppose the United States' torture program, and exercise some restraint on American war making. In all my years in the movement, I never really thought of writing a book. But it occurred to me around 2014, 2015, geez, somebody has to do this. This was a big, robust, spirited, dynamic movement. People gave years of their lives, immense sacrifice and courage to promoting peace. And yet it was so little remembered by historians, discussed by the media, memorialized in our culture. So I was trying to rescue the movement from a kind of memory hole and thought, here I have a professional skill set. I had written 2 books prior. I was half a degree of separation from all of the major movement figures. I understood the grammar of movement culture and had some sense of a timeline in my head of its important moments. And then I began this very ambitious project of researching, a social movement that spanned 7 or 8 years in my telling. And then I should say that though I was part of the movement and intimately involved with it, probably 95% of what I report on in the book, I had no idea was taking place, at the time. And then that was, in a sense, the biggest surprise, that the anti-war movement was more diverse, more pervasive, more diffuse and dispersed than I understood. So it was a huge education for me about a movement of which I was a part.
Well, and it's an incredibly valuable book in the sense that it pulls together a lot of different movements that were sort of connected to each other and sort of not. Some of them came out of much older movements. Like, I was happy to see the War Resisters League, which, Andrea Dworkin had her first internship when she was a student at Bennington with the War Resisters League, which is where she, met a whole bunch of people that she would later join as radical feminists. So there are these older groups, there are new groups that spring up, and you show how they do. There are also a lot of women in this book. And can you talk about the centrality of women to the modern peace movement?
Okay, this was another, I think, delicious discovery that a lot of the leading figures, as you indicate, in the post-2000 9/11 anti-war movement were indeed women. And then typically they were at the young end of the new left generation, were maybe adolescents during the Vietnam years. Older brothers and sisters may have gone to protest. So they were very much influenced by the movement culture of the 1960s, and many of them became essentially professional organizers and advocates working in global health, for abortion rights, to promote free speech rights, the rights of workers, etc., and had by the early 2000s vast experience in a wide variety of social movement activity, and a sense that, at least in a limited way, victory is possible if you have a strategic orientation, a good skill set, know how to work with Congress or work with some recalcitrant, company. So these were very idealistic people, but also with a pragmatic understanding that the point of so much activism is to have real gains in which hearts and minds and then policies shift. And then the most notorious women's-based group of this movement was, of course, Code Pink. And then this was created by Medea Benjamin, Diane Wilson, Gail Murphy, and a handful of others, all in their 40s at the time, with, a diverse range of social movement activity, who wanted to promote and privilege the voice of women in opposition to war. And they weren't essentialists who thought that, women were genetically oriented towards peace, but they understood that women are mothers and caretakers and moral guardians, and that in the course of modern warfare, more and more civilians and women are affected as victims, as opposed to men in standing armies. So the fact that women became prominent in an era of war making that is actually more destructive towards civilian life and female life and the lives of children made a kind of sense. And they detected in the war making effort an enormous amount of machismo, whether it's the gruff masculinity of Cheney or the kind of goofy cowboy persona of Bush. And they wanted to articulate values of peace, fellowship, connection, and compassion as an alternate set of values to the belligerence of the government. And I think some of the most impressive work that such forces did was going to Afghanistan and going to Iraq and working with women civil society leaders in those societies and working with the poor victims of U.S. aggression to offer them compassion, comfort, compensation as possible for, their suffering and loss. So there was a tremendous amount of sort of female to female fellowship, transcending national borders, often entailing great degrees of personal risk and hardship. And then women really emerge as some of the primary protagonists of my story. And I think I will have made my mother proud, who loved quoting the Harry Belafonte song, "That's right, the women are smarter." And I think the book proves that point.
Well, and these women were also pointing to one of the many lies that was told during the War on Terror, which is that Bush and Cheney promoted the War on Terror around the liberation of women. That, when the United States went to Afghanistan, women would be allowed to go to school again and re-enter the professions. That women in Iraq would no longer have to wear a burqa or, whatever. And so the use of women as a kind of cudgel, an excuse, a moral excuse for making war, is something that these American anti-war activists take on head on.
Yes, and I would add to that the notion that war appeals to the so-called security mom, right? That women are interested in safety in some basic sense. So the war on terror was waged on behalf of the good mothers of America, whose primary duty is to keep their children safe. And that's obviously a retrograde gendered ideology. But, women pushed back and then wanted to show that they could be fierce. And Code Pink became famous for its very provocative and confrontational direct actions, heckling government officials, various, kinds of displays and provocations outside of the White House, and then at times putting themselves in harm's way in active war theaters to say that we are the protectors of life and are duty-bound to make this sacrifice.
Yes, and of course, paradoxically enough, the War on Terror is also the first American conflict in which women are really in combat. And partway through the War on Terror, officially women are designated in combat roles, but these are also two wars where there is no front stage and backstage. And women, and really in the first Gulf War as well, women are ending up in combat situations even while not being officially in combat. So we've got this sort of weird moment of women being promoted within the military at the same time that women are taking a much bigger leadership role in the fight against the war as well.
Yes, also with some significant female backers of the war. And then here I would point to the centrality of, Hillary Clinton, who during the war published this book, It Takes a Village, all about, child rearing and nurturance. And a lot of her female constituents in New York, she was a senator at the time, were enraged that the world's leading feminist is aligning with a war so deeply destructive to the lives of women and children in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that they saw her as a kind of, hypocrite or an establishment feminist who didn't understand the natural opposition of feminism to militarism, within their understanding. And then, I should point to a couple of other things. I mean, one, several women played a central role in Iraq Veterans Against the War. The first executive director was a young woman named Kelly Doherty, who took a leadership role in this very important organization and a very male culture of veterans. And also there's, the tragic instance of women being involved in some of the sexual sadism at Abu Ghraib. And Barbara Ehrenreich, a famous feminist, gave a speech actually at Barnard's commencement saying that this is a horrifying moment because we have the wicked caricature of the Islamist condemnation of the decadence of the West, including gender equality and a kind of sexual perversion. And then here you see Iraqis exposed to terrible abuse that was an affront to deep-seated notions in their culture about the privacy and integrity of the body being, perpetrated by women. So there's obviously very complicated gender politics. And, very evidently, our current Department of War leader thinks that, the military became too soft, too woke, too influenced by DEI, too friendly to women. And the pendulum has swung again away from the kind of provisional equality that the military was promoting.
What you're describing, Jeremy, is a military, of course, that the Trump administration is trying to get women out of, trying to get transgender people out of, trying to get gay people out of, really, and make it a much more masculine environment. So I wonder if now we're kind of turning back to a time, and I'm thinking now about the murder of Renee Good in Minneapolis this week, if we're turning back to a time where the state is sort of endlessly masculine, and we're going to begin to see the face of resistance to the state, whether it's war making abroad or war making at home, as increasingly female.
I would hope so, to what you just laid out. I mean, let me first say that Trump and Hegseth are clearly obsessed with lethality. It's a word that they're in love with. And they see lethality as a military and masculine virtue. And at some level seem to get almost a libidinal thrill in killing people or asserting their right and their capacity to kill people. And I think this turn is based on a fundamental misapprehension that the war on terror somehow failed because it wasn't lethal enough, right? This was the same myth about Vietnam, fighting with one hand tied behind your back. We, didn't have the wherewithal to get the job done because we were too respectful of human rights. That's not the story of the Iraq War at all. The Iraq War was scandalously brutal, suffused with war crimes, gross and pervasive psychological, physical, and sometimes sexual abuse of Iraqi civilians. And the Iraqi people turned so bitterly against the occupation fundamentally because of the brutality of the occupation itself. Abu Ghraib is the most notorious instance, but Abu Ghraib-like violence was absolutely pervasive. And at a certain point, Iraqis banded against the Americans to defend in their minds their faith, their honor, their country, their family, and their home. And this is typically what happens with imperial misadventures. The imperialists sort of misunderstand people's sense of attachment to place, to nation, to identity, to culture, to family. As to today, yes, they're remasculinizing the military, and I think the face of this menace is the big, burly, masked ICE agent stepping out of some hulking SUV to try to tackle or otherwise abuse some vulnerable suspect. At the very end of the footage released this afternoon, presumably from the body cam, you hear possibly the shooter calling Ms. Good a effing bitch. And that speaks volumes about the attitude underlying this violence. And one of my grand conclusions from all of my opposition to and study of the war on terror is that sadly, a lot of people equate national strength and security with the ability to inflict harm and violence on vulnerable others. It might be a general tendency of nationalism when we need to sort of carefully study it. But there is a constituency that thinks the more pain we can exact, the stronger and the safer we are. And part of the abduction of Maduro was the spectacle of humiliating him, right? So there's this photograph of him wearing the goggles and the earmuffs. And all of the military experts say, oh, it's so he can't listen to conversations around him and doesn't know where he's going. But to anybody who's studied Guantanamo thoroughly, it's evocative of the images of the detainees brought to Guantanamo, where the earmuffs and hand muffs and the goggles were the exercise of carefully studied psychological techniques for a kind of sensory deprivation that can drive a person mad within an hour or two. So in effect, that was a kind of on-air form of, soft torture against a guy who 36 hours ago was, the president of a country, rightly or wrongly.
Right. Well, and they also strapped diapers on people and forced them to soil themselves for hours as they traveled to places.
And then that stuff like that is also a feature of the current immigration lockups. Like, I don't know if you've been reading about these presidents in Texas and Louisiana, but there's this willful subjection of the detainees to bodily filth as a dimension of their degradation.
Yeah, bodily filth. And then also, and we'll get back to your book in a second, because they're nicer people, but also when I was reading your account of Abu Ghraib in this book, I thought, well, CCOT, the Abu Ghraib came back to the Americas in the form of CCOT, except it's an institutionalized, highly technologized, intensified version of what was being done at Abu Ghraib. And that the American government actually sent people to CCOT knowing that they would be tortured is also a residue of this war, isn't it?
It is. And, I should say that when I wrote the book, part of the goal was to force a kind of reckoning with the unexamined legacy of the war on terror in legal terms, political terms, geopolitical terms, etc. And I feel like since the time of its publication, which was early November, in a way, the toxic legacy of the war on terror has come back with a vengeance, primarily in the form of the utter impunity with which the Trump administration and various federal agencies claim the right to exercise violence. In one case, to abduct a foreign leader, no matter what the UN Charter says, or the War Powers Act says, or national and international law says, or even what the American people think, only 33% of whom support the abduction. And in the case of the death of Miss Good, this notion that if you exercise your First Amendment rights, and heaven forbid, obey the order of law enforcement, the justifiable punishment may be your death. And when J.D. Vance says that these officers enjoy absolute immunity, this is the admission of a functional state of tyranny. And Americans are disgusted, and they are starting to rise up. And you actually have a wonderful suggestion that if there was a gender dimension to this as a resistance to a kind of weaponized hypermasculinity, that could add an interesting dimension to the protest. Though people on the right, of course, are going to say, oh, that's just wokeism, and that's what we in the first instance hate. So, the gender ideology warriors like yourself, and I mean it as a compliment, stay in the fight. Sadly, you've arguably never had greater evidence for your broad case. I mean, there's a president who's essentially a convicted rapist and a, proud misogynist. And then now a hyper-masculinized military, shooting like a lesbian mother, calling her a bitch. You can't make it up.
And saying it's her own fault. If only she had been obedient, she would have been spared. And that's the part that I think sort of broadcasts a general humiliation that is in store for women under this administration. So, Jeremy, let's go back to the beginning of the book, because it really gathers steam on 9/11, but there's a prequel to 9/11, which is the first Gulf War and a series of groups and actions in the 1990s that lay the basis for what is going to happen after the Twin Towers are struck. Can you talk about that a little bit? Who are these groups, and what are the tactics that they develop that we will then see forming the basis of the anti-war movement after 9/11?
Sure. I mean, so in 91, I was fresh out of college. I was a big, campus activist, and then immersed myself in anti-war politics in Washington, D.C., and actually affiliated with the National Coalition to Stop U.S. Intervention in the Middle East, whose great rival was the National Campaign for Peace in the Middle East. So, cue the Monty Python joke, right? So you had these two powerful coalitions. One of them hard left, another one center left. One of them refused to condemn Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. The other one said Hussein's a tyrant and sanctions might be a way to expel Iraq from Kuwait without going to war. One hostile to the Democratic Party, another willing to work with the Democratic Party. And these intramural differences between the two coalitions never ultimately amounted to much because the war came and went so quickly and was such a massive, decisive military victory for the United States that these divisions sort of quickly became kind of moot. But then that was followed by many, many years of sanctions against Iraq, which were horribly punitive, claimed tens or hundreds of thousands of lives, including the lives of many Iraqi children. And then forces from both of those two coalitions stayed in the struggle. And you had both hardcore communists and hardcore pacifists doing sanctions-busting missions in Iraq to try to bring in medicine and foodstuffs and raise public awareness of the devastating effect of these sanctions. So when 9/11 happens, you have literally some of the same characters with old grudges, old rivalries, long histories with one another. And the post 9/11 movement powerfully reflected that division. The smaller, more militant coalition was the Answer Coalition. And I know some of these folks, they're tend to be very doctrinaire, but also incredibly good at organizing. So instantly you see the printed signs. They're great with permits. They're wonderful defending civil liberties, including in, federal court. So they tend to be the first ones out of the gate. And a lot of people in the movement thought they were too extreme an organization to credibly lead what had to be a mass movement. So then this other coalition called United for Peace and Justice formed, and it was, much more mainstream, but still fairly firmly left. And then the two organizations work sometimes together, sometimes side by side, sometimes at each other's throats for the next years.
Well, and there are distinct groups that you describe. One is a lot of the families of 9/11 victims who say, we don't want a war. A response to this, that's really your title. Our grief is not a cry for war. Don't exploit what happened to us to do this terrible thing. Then you have the anti-war movement, and then you have a sort of broader American public that is kind of in favor of war. So how is it that anti-war organizers try to prevent this war from happening at all in that atmosphere?
Sure. Yes. So the anti-war movement, as you indicate, was diverse. Some of the real heroes of the story, as I see it, are these anti-war family members who lost loved ones on 9/11. And the basic message is, don't think you're doing this on behalf of my deceased husband, daughter, father. Don't think you're doing it on behalf of me. You are not avenging the crime of 9/11 by attacking Afghanistan and then Iraq. Rather, you're repeating the crime of 9/11 by exposing more civilians just like me to suffering, death, pain, and separation. So they had, a unique kind of moral authority to make the anti-war case. That didn't mean that they weren't also harassed and pilloried and, demonized by, haters throughout America, but they had a certain kind of, status and standing. And then, I should say that whereas most of the country was overwhelmingly for the Afghanistan war, Iraq was another matter. On the eve of the war, maybe 38 to 40% of Americans opposed it. There were very famous demonstrations on February 15th, 2003. Perhaps you went to one of them in which...
We did indeed. We were kettled.
Yes. Oh, you were kettled. Okay. Congratulations. So several million people turned out in the United States, and then globally between 15 and 30 million people turned out worldwide on all continents, including Antarctica, in what remains the single greatest day of protest in the history of the world. That didn't stop the war. People were crestfallen and heartbroken that the war started anyhow, but they didn't exit the fight. And then for years thereafter, tenaciously tried to educate the American public about the deceitful origins and terrible cost of this unfolding disaster. And they were working against a media that by and large underreported anti-war activism, against a propaganda machine that insisted that the mission was accomplished or it might be accomplished soon. There's light at the end of the tunnel just around the corner, all of those sort of rosy assessments that never came true, and a kind of visceral patriotism felt by many Americans that escalates when the lives of Americans are on the line in some foreign intervention. And when the Iraq War so obviously bogged down and became a quagmire, prima facie, the case of the anti-war movement, grew much stronger. And then eventually a critical mass of Americans could see the great chasm between the virtual delusional picture of the war that Bush and Rumsfeld presented and the reality on the ground to the extent that it could even be discerned. And by 2005, 2006, durable majority lost patience with the war, which had descended into what I call an unmanageable maelstrom of chaos and death, completely inscrutable, politically, with no end in sight and no objective worthy of the sacrifice. And it took many more years for the war to then end, but there was a moment of turning, and then that should give us some hope. The Bush administration also thought it was waging its power without constraint. But there was the constraint of the Iraqi resistance and eventually the constraint of growing public skepticism towards the war. And there were some very important defections, like John Murtha. Do you remember him? He was a pro-war Democrat. And in the Mirthquake, he said, this war has to end yesterday. The people are way ahead of Congress. He visited Walter Reed Hospital. He read the letters of constituents saying you must end this war and had a change of heart. And then I should reference also a Republican congressman, either Jones or Johnson, who was behind banning French fries from the Capitol cafeteria and calling them freedom fries. He eventually felt so distraught over his support of the war that until his death, he personally wrote something like 12,000 families of deceased and severely wounded soldiers in an unbelievable private act of recompense and redemption.
Well, it's interesting. I want to pick up on that because one of the things that I remember thinking when we were protesting and trying to get the war to not happen is that there was no reflection on what the residue of other wars had been. I had known endless numbers of people who were older than me who came back from Vietnam just kind of broken. They weren't evil people, they weren't bad people, but they struggled with addiction. They couldn't get their lives together. They struggled with PTSD. Some people were fine. And, the psychologists know that some people are fine and some people are not. And we don't know why that is. But I just remember thinking that the costs in humanity, in medical care, in trying to clean up after this war were not being discussed at all. How is it that the public manages to forget over and over and over again that the outcome of war is terrible?
I mean, that's the central and eternal lesson, that war is always hell for all of its combatants. The cause and context for war crimes is war. The torture at Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib was, in a sense, a byproduct of the invasion of Afghanistan. And then war is always a profound human failing. And any sense of history or rigorous morality should scream that war is, to the best extent possible, to be avoided. But this is the great, unlearned lesson. And the government always makes the claim of national security, always promises swift and certain victory, and always claims the mantle of virtue, or almost always. Like Trump might be a different matter, but George Bush waged the war on terror as the defense of civilization itself against barbarism. Everything that is pure and decent and true and good about Enlightenment modernity, from freedom of religion to freedom of speech to gender equality to you name it. So Americans went into the war, many Americans regarded the war as deeply purposeful and moral to neutralize, thugs who are, beyond the pale. And then that idealism did not drive the narrative of the conflict. And in fact, so much American conduct was exactly contrary to the righteous claims. And then within the anti-war movement, I was most especially an anti-torture activist. And it broke my heart, and my heart is still broken, to know that America committed in a serious way as a matter of policy to catastrophic violation of human dignity that is torture. And then in my anti-war activism, I thought we were just calling the country back to its constitution and the rule of law and common sense morality and everything that it, claimed to be defending. And then to the soldiers, I mean, they were in some senses both perpetrators and victims, and then had, paid an enormous price and shouldered an enormous burden. And then a lot of the psychological problems that you referenced are absolutely prevalent among this new generation of veterans. Something like 22 to 26 veterans commit suicide every day. And it used to be the Vietnam generation, and now it's tilted more and more to the veterans of more recent wars. And psychologists and others have really developed this concept of moral harm that you may have, heard of. There's books and books written about it, or moral injury, and a sense that part of the injury that these people bore was their conscientious sense of having done wrong. And that's an absolutely terrible thing to have to live with. And a small and courageous, subset of the veterans were honest, confessing both what they had done and their profound moral misgivings. And one of the most indecent things I find about war is, rich men in expensive suits making young men and now women bear the sort of filthy burden of their arrogance and often the utter corruption of their intent. So the Vietnam veterans were betrayed, and then I would argue that another generation of soldiers has been betrayed. Even as some may have acted honorably, civilian assistants, fought the bad guys, have sort of pride in their service. But it's painful for the country to recognize that in the case of Iraq, at least, the sacrifice appeared to be for nothing. And even Trump says that. And how do you live with that?
Yes. Well, and there is one theory that the fact that these wars were fought on the backs of the poor, because of course we no longer had a draft, so the poor are incentivized to join the military to gain skills, to get education, to support their families, and so on. There is one theory about the MAGA movement that it is a profound sense of betrayal, and to draw a sort of inaccurate but vivid comparison, that's not dissimilar from Germany in the 1920s, that this sense that there is a whole elite group of people that have fed you into the wood chipper, and you're supposed to make sense of it afterwards, can really push people towards populist resistance that is not at all progressive. I
think that's right. And very dramatic, but I think, poignant language. And I think a lot of veterans did feel like they were fed into the wood chipper by, globalist elites. And then Trump has a populist, anti-globalist message. And I think some veterans identify with him so strongly, or active duty military, as somebody who has their back, who gets them, who understands them, and isn't going to turn them into, cannon fodder. Trump's belligerence is ticking up. And then his big dilemma is that he wants all of the spoils of conquest without launching another stupid war. So with the Venezuela intervention, there's all this talk, oh my God, it's going to be another Iraq. And it could be, and that's an important warning. But I think Trump doesn't want it to be another Iraq. So they're trying to figure out, how can you coercively achieve your ends with little or no loss of American life? And then sadly, the sort of moral wages of public discussion is that so long as no American dies, who really gives a damn? The dream of first century war makers is war with as close to zero losses as possible. Long distance, remote, mechanized. And when Trump says that, we had a second wave for Venezuela planned, I think it would be a huge fusillade of cruise missiles to assassinate the current leader and, blow up ministries and civilian neighborhoods. They really want to do this in a way where no American dies, so Trump doesn't have that on his head and MAGA doesn't turn against him. And then how many American casualties would start to feel unacceptable to the American people? Who knows? We're not there yet, but it is a very sort of perilous game with the politics of American death being perhaps the most important grammar to structure the conversation.
Right. Now, Jeremy, I want to talk about something else, because as I was reading your book, I was sort of hit with this wave of despair. Okay, I've been involved with all of these peace movements all my life, and they've never stopped a war. On the other hand, they do other things. And I think your book really evokes the level to which people who care about justice actually survive and reproduce themselves in peace movements that may not stop wars, but they actually do build a kind of social justice infrastructure and intellectual apparatus that can prepare us for the next challenge. Is that a good reading of your book?
I think that was superbly put. I mean,
thank you.
Beautifully articulated. And I would say, that if anti-war movements don't often stop wars, they tend to limit their intensity and duration. And that was the ultimate effect of the anti-Vietnam War movement. It probably would have lasted longer and more people probably would have died. And that's probably the best you can say about this anti-war movement too, that if it didn't exist at all, the war would have been longer and bloodier, and probably the U.S. still would have met ruin in Iraq, but it would have been a much more protracted story. So I would like to believe that we can save lives even though the number is never verifiable. And then there's that whole question of building community and connection and compassion and fellowship. And then these things are in and of themselves good, and they also do help to grow infrastructures of resistance to be mobilized in the face of the next outrage. And then interestingly, I'm just finishing a book called On Activism, Friendships, and Fighting by Ben Shepard. I don't know if you know him, but he's a famous HIV AIDS activist. And then it's all about the centrality of friendship within activism, which is not anything I've ever sort of explicitly thought of until reading his book. But I realized, I met my wife in activism. My 3 best male friends who are all active. Maybe there's something, to this. So not only does like kind of find like, but these deep affective, bonds form, as do prefigurative communities that try to model compassion and understanding itself as an act of resistance to whatever is motivating war.
Well, and I've noticed here in Western Massachusetts that in the current crisis, there are all of these people who have been active in previous movements. And when Trump was elected the first time, they were ready. And they started things and got people together. And, we have little demonstrations in town and so on. But also, every time there's another crisis, these groups go into motion in a more intense way. They pull more people in. And they also serve the purpose, I think, of helping us all, when these catastrophic things happen, whether it is a city being leveled with American bombs, or whether it is, I'm thinking Gaza, but I'm also thinking the cities in Ukraine being leveled by the Russians. I mean, there's so much violence in the world, and it's so hard to respond to, which is why something like Renee Good's murder just sort of lights the fuse on a certain level. But I think a lot of these groups, as they have sustained themselves over the years, provide a real social function of reaching out to people and saying, come to the park, make a sign, listen to speakers, you will be with friends. You don't live in a completely hostile environment. And that is useful too, even when you fail to stop the war.
I mean, I'm an incorrigible and inveterate protester who's been to, hundreds, if not thousands of rallies and vigils, big and small. So, I vote with my feet, and such gatherings do have the purpose that you describe. Like, that said, I'm deeply worried that whatever resistance is being mounted is inadequate to the authoritarian threat that Trump poses. And you would like to believe that the constraints of law and congressional action and the media were more significant, and it wasn't up to grassroots activists in Northampton, standing on a corner with a sign encouraging people to honk their horns to save American democracy. Like, we're at a very, very, very dangerous threshold where, again, Trump's message to the world is stop me if you can. He says he's accountable only to his own morality, which is no morality at all.
Gary.
Yes. Stephen Miller basically said the only law that makes sense is the law of force, the law of jungle. It's been that way since sort of Roman times. And these are folks who feel entitled to take through the use of force or the threat of force. And to an alarming degree, to this point, they appear to be getting away with it. And then this is what we feared when Trump won re-election, which itself is remarkable because he took a murderous riot to overthrow a free and fair election and somehow convinced enough Americans that this was a glorious day of, pushback against, the deep state. So there's a massive ideological distortion entailing a vandalism of basic observable truths, and then a politics of lawless violence emanating from it.
Yeah. So, Jeremy, there's so much to talk about with this book, and it's so valuable and in many ways comforting in this moment because listeners, you'll read about people who are grappling with the same kinds of despair as we are now and turning that despair into work and love and creative ways of trying to make an argument in public that no one wants them to make. Jeremy, if you were to, in a capsule form, tell our listeners why they should read this book now, what would you tell them?
Okay, the first thing I would say is that anytime a grave injustice exists, it's important to know for the moral and political and historical record who stood up, why, what did they do, and what difference did their conduct make. The war on terror was a moral catastrophe. 1 million people dead as a direct consequence of U.S. interventions, 4 million dead as an indirect consequence, almost 40 million displaced, $8 trillion and counting, right? And then there were people in the United States and all over the world, conservative, liberal, inside government, outside government, who tried to impose some constraints on this outrage. And they have a deserving place in the great annals of American descent, along with the suffragettes, the abolitionists, civil rights folks, labor folks, etc. So if you value the tradition of conscientious dissent, which is one of the great veins of American democracy, then you should appreciate the sacrifice and commitment of these people. And then I would say it demonstrates that qualified victories, can be had, but it takes a lot of smarts and a lot of strategy. And we need to learn, the positive and negative example of, whatever people tried as they tried to mobilize people power.
Fantastic. Jeremy, thank you so much for writing this book. Thank you so much for coming on the show. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from listeners about this episode.
Great. Thanks so much.
And that's it for today's show. Thanks for hanging out with us. Share this podcast with a friend who loves history, politics, and smart conversation. You can follow us on Threads, Blue Sky, X, TikTok, and Instagram. Go to the Political Junkie Substack at clairepotter.substack.com for show notes, more episodes, to leave a comment or question, to subscribe for free, or to support our work for as little as $5 a month. You can also subscribe for free by searching for us on your favorite platform. If you do, please leave a rating and a comment so that other listeners can find us. Our podcast is supported by the New School for Social Research and by paying subscribers. Political Junkie is written, recorded, edited, and produced by me, Claire Potter. Today's theme is Rambler Blues by Mississippi Lightnin'. You can find their work and all the talented artists we feature on these episodes on Soundstripe. That's all for now. See you next week.